Hey everyone, welcome to SingularityComputers Client Build 11, Part 3. I'm going to start this part of the build log by installing the pump and reservoir. Previously in the build log I mentioned that I was waiting on an EK mounting system which was going to allow me to mount the pump and res config to the bottom panel of the case. I'm now going to take you through the installation of this mounting system. Now it's designed specifically for DDC pumps, and DDC pumps come in a lot of different versions. The one that I have here is the Swiftech MCP35X. The mounting system comes in 3 different versions. You can get the mounting system on its own, and you can also get the mounting system with this replacement pump casing, which comes in either black or silver. And not only does this vastly improve the aesthetics of the configuration, it also improves the cooling. You can see the inbuilt heatsink and ventilation. So the first thing you need to do is remove the pump top. Whether it's a custom pump top or the stock pump top, it's the same process. You just need to undo the 4 bolts from the bottom of the pump. You then need to remove the pump itself from the pump casing, and I suggest pushing it up from the bottom. Sometimes they can be in there fairly tightly, so they can be difficult to remove. You then need to install the included thermal pad. Make sure you get the correct orientation. And you can then slide the pump into the new pump casing. Now the thermal pad is important because not only does it help with heat transfer, it could stop potential shorts into the pump casing. Once you've assembled the pump and pump casing, install the O-ring, make sure you have it installed properly, and you can then install the pump top and bolt the entire assembly together. Now make sure you get the orientation of the pump to the pump top correct. You want the wiring facing a side of the pump top where it's going to be out of sight. I suggest installing the anti-vibration rubber mounts into the silver mounting components before you tighten the assembly, because you actually need to tighten the assembly by hand. I found it easy enough to tighten the assembly by hand, but if you have problems, you can use the included small black mounting screws, and then you can tighten the assembly with a Phillips head screwdriver, but the screws will be difficult to remove, and those screws are actually for mounting this config to your case. Obviously this mounting system is designed for mounting this config to a horizontal surface, so you can see how much the EK pump casing improves the aesthetics of this config, and it's compatible with the Bits Power components, which is great to see. This means that it's probably going to be compatible with most DDC pump tops. I've now completed the assembly of the pump and res config and installed it into the case. Looking underneath the build, you can see how I've mounted it to the bottom panel. I drilled the holes previously, and I've used the included mounting bolts as well as some nylon washers. I'm really happy with this custom configuration, in particular the EK mounting system. Bits Power has had a D5 pump casing out for a number of years now. It would be nice to see a Bits Power version of this EK pump casing with all of the usual Bits Power colors and finishes. You can see that I've swapped the aqua pipe. This is the Bits Power aqua pipe 2, and the difference is it screws down from the top, unlike the aqua pipe 1, which actually screws up from underneath, leaving enough room in the thread for a fitting to be screwed down from the top. You can see that I've sleeved the pump wiring at this point. So this pump has 2 cables, a Molex cable to power the pump, and it's a PWM pump, so it has a PWM cable which I've connected to the CPU fan header. And I'll set up fan profiles in the BIOS to control the RPM of the pump. I'm now starting on the tubing. As I've mentioned many times previously, before you start your tubing, you first of all need to have all of your core water cooling components installed. You then need to plan out your loop, and there's 2 main things you need to think about when you're planning your loop. First of all, and most importantly, your component order, and secondly, your tubing routing. Once you've planned out your loop, if you're using hard tubing, you then need to install all of your fittings. If you don't have your fittings installed, you have no way of getting the measurements and angles for your lengths of tube. So you really need to have your entire water cooling loop planned out before you start on your tubing, particularly if you're using hard tubing. I've now completed the water cooling loop. Initially I was planning on bending the acrylic tube in this build, but as you can see I've used fittings for the bends and straight lengths of acrylic tube. There's a couple of reasons I decided to go this way. As I started building the loop, I realized it was only going to take literally a couple more fittings to use fittings for the bends, and there was also some difficult sections of tube which were going to take a lot of fittings anyway. Now recently I've had a lot of comments on this, and most people are actually saying that they prefer the aesthetics of using fittings for the bends instead of bending the acrylic tube. So put it in the comments, which do you prefer? If you take a look at my builds right back to Nighthawk, I've used fittings for the bends, and I've also used 12mm acrylic tube with a 12mm external diameter and a 10mm internal diameter, because this was the size of the first acrylic tube system available for water cooling. But recently in client build 12, I bent the acrylic tube right through for both of the loops. But there was something else very different about client build 12. I was also using 16mm acrylic tube. Acrylic tube with a 16mm external diameter and a 12mm internal diameter. Personally, I prefer the aesthetics of using fittings for the bends because I'm a big lover of Bits Power fittings. As most of you will know, my favorite is Bits Power Black Sparkle. But it still depends on the build, the aesthetics you are going for, obviously. And for me, it also depends on the diameter of the acrylic tube, because with the larger diameters, 16mm and even 14mm Primo Chill acrylic tube, I prefer the aesthetics of bending the acrylic tube. I'm now going to fill the water cooling loop. So you can see I have everything set up and ready to go, all of the usual precautions in place, paper towels wherever there could be a leak. To fill the loop, I've had to hook up a 90-degree fitting with a barb fitting and some tubing. I've also hooked up the drainage system, and this is probably the most important precaution against leaks, because what are you going to do when you get a leak? You really need to empty your loop as quickly as possible to stop the leak from doing any further damage. So have your drainage system hooked up and ready to go when you're filling your loop. I also have the external power supply here ready to go. This is a Phobia external power supply. Now you can see the coolant I have mixed up here. This was actually Mayhem's Pastel Ice White, and I've added Mayhem's Red Dye. And I don't think it's quite dark enough at this point. I'm still going to add some more dye. It's incredible how much dye you need to color Mayhem's pastel coolants. Obviously, because they're opaque, you need more dye. With Mayhem's X1, with the clear coolants, you need a fraction of the dye to color the coolant. I'm now about to start the pump for the first time. Notice that I haven't filled the reservoir all the way to the top, just in case some air bubbles up or I get backflow or back pressure when I start the pump for the first time. Sometimes the reservoir can overflow. So as you can see, I had to fill the res 3 times and start the pump 3 times before the loop was fully circulating. And you can see the last time I started the pump how quickly the coolant circulated through the graphics card water block and back into the reservoir. That gives you an idea of how quickly the coolant circulates through the loop. And that is when there is still air in the loop. So, it's going to be even faster than that. And I used to get a lot of people commenting on component order, how critical it is. And you can see from this is an example of how fast the coolant actually flows through the loop, that component order really doesn't matter. So the loop is full and the leak test is now complete. Previously I mentioned what I initially had in mind for the front panel, that I wanted the light from the red LED fan to shine through the cover panel. But the red LED fan wasn't bright enough and the cover panel wasn't transparent enough. So I've now installed 2 Bitfinex Alchemy red LED strips, one on either side of the front panel. And the camera is not actually doing it justice. They're actually a lot brighter than they look on camera, and also a darker red. These were 30cm LED strips which I've cut down to size, and I've placed them on the inside of the 10mm white acrylic facing forwards. To do this I had to use 3M clear double-sided tape. And I've also blanked off the inside of the LED strips using 3M matte black vinyl. I currently have them running from an external power supply, but I'm going to hook them up to the Mod My Toys fan splitter, which I have installed at the front of the build. So you can see how the coolant color turned out. I'm really happy with it now. It's a nice vibrant red. When I was filling the loop, it was still a pinkish color, so I actually added a fair bit more dye after I filled the loop. And I ended up using 2 whole 10 ml bottles of Mayhem's red dye in 1 liter of Mayhem's Pastel Ice White coolant. As I mentioned, it takes a lot of dye to color Mayhem's pastel coolant. Some of you may be thinking that all this dye is going to cause problems in the loop. This is a subject I've covered a lot of times previously, and I'm not going to go into detail on it now. But I will say that most of the problems in water cooling loops have been blamed on coolant and dyes, when there's so many other things that can cause problems in a water cooling loop. From my experience in testing, the biggest causer of problems in water cooling loops is soft tubing, breaking down, leaching plasticizer, and then there's also corrosion from mixing metals, from using low quality components, distilled water on its own, microbial growth. As long as you use high quality components, coolant and dye, then you are very unlikely to have problems. One problem that you do need to put up with when using dye is staining, but I find that staining is really not a problem. I mean, it only becomes a problem if you're planning on changing your coolant color and using the same components. And most of the time you can just flush your loop a few times and it will remove staining, but worst case scenario, you may need to dismantle some of your clear or acrylic components and wipe them down with alcohol. If soft tubing stains, you just need to replace it. Now sometimes I go over all of the fittings I've used in my loops. I'm not going to do that this time. If you take a look at the fittings I've used here, it's fairly straightforward. As always, I've used Bits Power Black Sparkle fittings right through, and I've used mostly 90-degree single rotary fittings, a couple of 90-degree dual rotary fittings. For the drainage system, I've used a Bits Power tap and Q fitting, which I often use in my builds, and I've used Bits Power dual O-ring multi-link fittings right through. All that needs to be done now to complete the build is the rest of the custom wiring and cable management and the lighting. So the system is now complete, and I'm now going to give you a good look around, starting with the wiring. The 24-pin cable was fairly difficult to fit into position, mainly because of the positioning of the 24-pin connector on this motherboard, and where I installed the pump and res config. It only left a small gap for the 24-pin cable. I did try to route it up from the other side, but there is even less room on the other side of the build. There's a large bundle of cables running up this side because it's not only the 24-pin cable, it's also the 8-pin EPS and the SATA power cable. You can see this Molex connector here. This is for the pump. I've made it easy to disconnect the pump to fill the loop. The other Molex cable here runs to the Mod My Toys fan splitter, from which I'm running all of the fans in this build, the 180mm fan on the front panel and the 2 120mm fans on the top panel, as well as I've mentioned, the 2-bit Phoenix Alchemy red LED strips on the front panel. The SATA data cables I've used in this build are 150mm in length. It's important to get your hands on some shorter SATA data cables for small form factor builds. Now you can see I'm running 3 cables here to 4-pin fan headers on the motherboard. One of them is for the pump and the other 2 are for lighting. And this is a technique I've started using for lighting recently to reduce cable mess. It's a great way of reducing cables because often the fan headers on the motherboard are the closest power sources to your lighting. And most of the time, lighting uses a whole lot less power than fans, so there's really no problem running it from your motherboard. Just make sure you wire it up correctly. Looking from the other side of the build, you can see how I've routed the PCI Express cables. I routed them out this way to show off the graphics card water block as much as possible. The other option would have been to route them down in front of the graphics card. This cable is for the power button. It runs up to the motherboard behind the graphics card, and you can see I've routed it across the bottom panel up next to the 180mm fan to the back of the power button. So that's a brief look at the custom cables and cable management in this build. Now, while I was coming up with the ideas for the front panel mods and drawing up the measurements, I realized that the cover panel was going to create a lot of blank space and that it was going to potentially look unbalanced. So I went through a number of different ideas to solve this problem, including cutting different shapes into the cover panel, using transparent acrylic, using different case badges. The idea that I settled on was having the light from the red LED fan shining through the cover panel, as I've mentioned. After this didn't work, I moved on to the Bitfinex Alchemy red LED strips, but they obviously still don't solve the problem because they're on either side of the cover panel. A number of people commented on this on the last video, and a few people mentioned that the case badge from the stock Bitfinex Prodigy front panel would be a great idea. So as you can see, I've now installed this case badge, and it certainly solves the problem. It creates balance on the front panel, and I think it looks great here. Initially, I did think about this, but I didn't want to go ahead with it because I preferred not to use a stock component. I wanted to create something custom. But I am actually doing the front panel mods on my own time, and I certainly have other projects to work on. The configuration I've gone for the lighting in this build, the main lighting I've installed on the front panel to create the feature on the front panel. The white lighting I've installed at the back of the build is only to create a soft glow to make the components more visible. I installed the LED strips at the back of the build facing inwards. I could also have installed them facing forwards, which would have created a lot more light shining further towards the front of the build. But I installed them inwards to create a softer glow. The reason for installing lighting in a build is to maximize the aesthetics, and there's a lot of different lighting techniques you can use to do this. My favorite lighting technique would have to be lighting the main features of a build. My main priority when installing lighting though is hiding the light source, which often means not maximizing the aesthetics of a build because you can't really do both at the same time. So lighting is something I'd like to see developed, and I'm currently looking at different techniques and components for lighting, which you might see in future videos. I've now installed the side panels, so you can now see the finished product fully assembled. And I'm currently in the process of doing the temperature testing. When using white, it's very easy to see even the slightest difference in color. And as people mentioned on the last video, you can see the color difference between the plastic sections at the top and bottom of the case and the side panels. And this is because I've completely repainted this case, including the side panels, and the white acrylic I've used for the front panel mods almost perfectly matches the color of paint I've used, which is a standard white. So the stock color of the Bitfinex Prodigy is certainly not a standard white, it's more of a light gray. As you can see, the plastic sections have a bluish tinge to them. Some of you will be wondering why I didn't just paint the plastic sections. I actually did this in Client Build 6, only by client request, and I had a massive amount of trouble. It was only after many attempts and sanding back the surface many times that I actually got it to work and got a decent finish. The surface was melting, even when I first started the primer, the surface started melting and the plastic was just falling apart. It's really not designed to be painted. And there's also the increased risk of the paint cracking and peeling due to how flexible this plastic is, but there is paint that is designed for that. Another option is vinyl dye, but I'm not going to get a perfect match with vinyl dye anyway. So looking at the options that are available and the actual color difference between these different surfaces, it's not such a big problem. If there was a viable option, I would take it though. I'm now going to move on to the test results. Now I'm currently in the process of improving my methods for recording both noise output and power consumption, so I didn't actually record either for this build. But all of the components are rated at less than 20 decibels noise output, and the loudest component would have been the pump, but only at 100% load when the components had heated up, and still it was very quiet. Most of the time the pump was running at near half its RPM because I have the pump running PWM controlled, in which case it was completely silent. This build is very quiet. My estimation would be definitely less than 20 decibels noise output. So I'm now going to move on to the temperature results. Now I overclocked this build, so I'm going to include stock clocked results and overclocked results. The overclock was 4.4 gigahertz, 1.3 volts for the CPU. For the graphics card, I overclocked it 150 MHz on both the core and memory and increased the power limit to the maximum. For all of my testing, I mathematically adjust my ambient temperature to 20 degrees Celsius. All of my results are in degrees Celsius. For the idle test, I cold boot the system and let it idle for 30 minutes. For the load test for the CPU, I use Prime 95 small FFT for 30 minutes. For the graphics card, I use the Unigen Heaven benchmark for 30 minutes. So first of all, the CPU results. At idle, at stock clocks, 25 degrees, overclocked 27 degrees. At load, stock clocks, 48 degrees, overclocked 70 degrees. The GPU results. At idle, at stock clocks, 22 degrees, overclocked 24 degrees. At load, at stock clocks, 35 degrees, overclocked 43 degrees. Now, the hottest I saw the motherboard and PCH get, the motherboard was 33 degrees, the PCH 51 degrees. The temperatures for the motherboard and PCH were just incredibly stable. This is an amazing motherboard. Other ITX motherboards I've overclocked with, the motherboard and PCH temperatures have just been out of control. And I had to, really limit the overclocks and the voltages because of it. But this is an amazing little board. So now moving on to the performance results, which I'm going to include in screenshots. I have stock clock results and overclocked results. So you can see the substantial performance difference the overclock made with some of the results. I could certainly have pushed this system a lot further, mainly thanks to the motherboard. But because it's a client build, I have to allow for all of the possibilities. I can't push the hardware, the overclocks, too far. Although if requested, I will max out the overclocks and push the hardware as far as I can. So it's now time for me to conclude this build log. The Bitfinex Prodigy has been a popular case recently. I mean, I've done 3 Bitfinex Prodigy builds so far, and I currently have another one lined up, and no doubt there'll be more after that. I actually really recommend this case for beginner modders because it's a cheaper case. If you make a mistake, it's not such a big problem starting again, and it's always a lot easier to work with smaller cases because it means, less planning. There's less work that needs to be done, and it's just a lot of fun. It's a blank canvas for modding. There's so much that can be done with it. So that sums up this build log. I have so much coming up. I still need to complete the client build 12 build log, and then I have build logs for client builds 13, 14, 15, and 16 starting soon. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and favorite if you want to see more.